Hello, friends. Doug Schaible here, and welcome once again to the Premature Bible Institute. I like to refer to myself as your free-range podcaster, so that's what I'm doing, trying to inform you of things that I think are that have been important to me over the years, and I do appreciate the truths that I get to learn, and hopefully pass these on to you all and to use as you see fit. As you can tell by my background, I'm not where I'm normally at. I'm actually up in Wisconsin at one of Ethnos 360's Bible Institutes in Waukesha, Wisconsin. And so I just brought my equipment with me so I could do this because I'm going to be on the road for a little bit. And so I want to make sure I'm caught up and I don't get behind or anything. So anyway, enough said for that. I just want to go ahead and continue on with where we were last week. The next few lessons are going to be very, very important lessons. They're really key, and they really help us to understand. These next two lessons are going to be God is preparing Israel to receive the Ten Commandments and the commandments, the law. And then the three lessons after that are going to be the giving of the law. And so we'll talk about those. Those are very, very important, very key issues in the life of a believer, no matter whether they're Jewish or Gentile or whatever. And so what we want to do is really sit down and focus on those things and talk about that. Now, before we go on to that, I want to start talking a little bit about the last lesson, do a little bit of review. In the last lesson, we saw that after Israel had left Egypt, they got out on the road a little bit and they started complaining about food. And as they complain about food, okay, God says, all right, I'll take care of that. And so he brings quail. And if you read the whole story, there's times where he brings so many quail, it says that it came out of their nostrils. And the point of that was not that it was actually coming out of their nostrils, but there was just so much food. There was more than they could possibly eat. And he says, okay, you want to complain? I'm going to show you something. And so he gives them so much that there's no reason for any complaint. But then they started complaining about having too much food too. So God gave them food. So they complained about food. God gave them food. Then they started complaining about not having water. And what does God tell Moses to do? Tells him to strike the rock with his staff and water come gushing out, enough to feed probably 2.5 million people. So wasn't any problem there. So God gave them water. They complained, God gave. God is a gracious God, and he does things for people. But there are always consequences to the things that we do. And so the journey goes on, and then they, not very much longer, and they end up at a place called Mount Sinai. Now, this is a famous landmark. We have Mount Sinai Hospital that a lot of medical work has been done over the years. So there's been a lot of things that was named, of course, after this event. So God brings Israel to this place called Mount Sinai. And so let's read here in Exodus chapter 19, verses 1 and 2. It says, in the third month, after the children of Israel had gone out of the land of Egypt, on the same day they came to the wilderness of Sinai. For they had departed from Rephidim, had come to the wilderness of Sinai, and camped in the wilderness. So Israel camped there before the mountain. So Israel comes up to this mountain. Now, this whole time they're being led by this column of smoke and column of fire. By fire at night, by a cloud of smoke, a column of smoke during the day. And so it's always leading them. So they always know where they're going because they just follow this cloud or this column of fire or column of smoke, depending on what time it was. Whenever it lifted up and moved, the people of Israel got up and moved. Whenever it stopped, they stopped. So they're coming up now to Mount Sinai, and God has them camp around this Mount Sinai. So one thing we're learning about this is that Israel didn't decide where they wanted to go. God decided where they should go. God is the creator. He owns everything. He knows what's best for the people. He sees the end from the beginning and sees eternity present, eternity future, eternity past. He knows everything that needs to be known. So he's guiding them the whole way. No, they're not guiding themselves. And then God decides to remind Israel once again of who he is. In verses 3 and 4 of 19, it says this, and Moses went up to God. So in other words, he went up onto the mountain in Sinai. And the Lord called to him from the mountain, saying, thus you shall say to the house of Jacob, and tell the children of Israel, you have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings, and brought you to myself. So he's reminding them, he says, listen, don't forget, who's the one that brought you out of Egypt and who's the one that is bringing you here? It's me, the Lord. And so he wants them to remember because they tend to forget these things and what he can do. So let's review some of these characteristics of God. God always, let me talk with one in specific. God always fulfills his promises. He does what he's going to say he's going to do. Remember, he did this with Adam and Eve. Listen, don't eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because in the day that you'll eat of it, he says, you will die. And sure enough, they did eventually, of course, that. But they were cut off from him, the source of their life. So they were separated from God. And then he put them out of the garden, and so on. He made the same promise to Noah. He said, listen, he says, here's what's going to happen. 120 years from now, there's going to be a flood that's going to wipe out the earth. Build an ark and do what I tell you to do. Remember what God says? Come into the ark. When he says come into the ark, that assumes that God's in the ark. So God, even though he can't be contained and fills eternity, he's saying to them, listen, I'm going to protect you. I'm going to watch out for you. I'm going to take care of you for this time when you're on the ark. And so they did what they did. And he also did the same thing with Abraham. He told Abraham, he says, in you shall all nations of the earth be blessed. And so that's what he started to do. So Israel was there now, and God is bringing them to the mountain, and he wants to let them know who he is and what he has done. So God alone has the right to set the rights. Let me put it. God alone has the right to set the rules for human behavior. He created humans. He tells them what they should do, but he gave them a choice, gave them a will, so that they could either obey him or disobey him. And so he had the right to do that. Now, man will always judge what is right from his own preconceived ideas about what he thinks is right. So in other words, if I think this is right, and I think you see this in today's culture, I do what's best for me. I will do what's right, in my own eyes. And be yourself is another one. So God doesn't want us to be like ourselves. He wants us to be like him. And so man tries to judge and do what is right. And as the creator, God is the one who owns everything that exists. So he by nature has the right to say what needs to be done. But all of this is building a foundation for a good future, for a future truth. So God is telling all these different stories, these events that are happening through history, and he's telling it to them so that everything that he's telling them is building towards a future truth, something that's going to be coming later on. And we want to build good foundations for that. So the law is part of that. And so everything up to this point is leading up to this event. And all of these events, including this one, will lead to future events. So that's something we want to do. Now, God always does what is best for those whom he created. In other words, when he creates people, he's not out there to destroy them and get them and go after them. He wants to do what is best for people. And he will do it in a way, though, that is consistent with his nature and character. He will never act in a way that is inconsistent with who he is. And so we need to understand that. God, many times, he validates his word when people obey him. And but sometimes he does it after they obey him. In other words, he says, this is what I'm going to do, and here's how you're going to know. When you do this, then you'll know that I did what I said I was going to do. But he doesn't do it a lot of times beforehand. He doesn't say, okay, I'll do this for you now. Now you go and do this. Sometimes he says, go do this, and then I'll show you this is what I said I was going to do. So we know this, and God's sign to Israel was to be shown not before they left Egypt, but after they left Egypt. Remember in Exodus chapter 3, verse 12, he says this to Moses. So he said, I will certainly be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. So it's an interesting thing that he's saying there, isn't it? He says, this will be a sign to you. Not before you leave Israel or Egypt, but after you get here to this mountain. That's going to be the proof that I sent you. So now Moses and Israel are coming up to this mountain, and they should have looked at it and says, God kept his word. This was the sign he said he would give, that Moses would bring us back here. And so they've done that. So God is fulfilling what he said he would do. But God didn't use just natural means in order to deliver Israel. In other words, He didn't give them money so they could pay their way out. He didn't give them a lot of things. He brought these terrible plagues on Egypt and showed them that his power and that there is no other God beside him, and that he wanted to do that. So he is proving to them that he was going to deliver Israel through the signs that he did. He did not want anybody to be able to explain away how they were delivered. In other words, well, the reason I was delivered is because I thought of this idea or that idea or whatever. No, he used a series of 10 plagues, and he said, this is what it's going to do. There's going to be the blood, and there's going to be the lice, and there's going to be the frogs, and there's going to be the hail, and then eventually and finally there's going to be the last plague where the firstborn in Egypt were going to die. And so he did as he said. Then also another sign that he showed that he was going to do what he said, he brought the quail. Then he brought the water. Or the manna, I should say, the manna, that frost, it's like stuff that was on the ground, and they ate that for 40 years, believe it or not. And then he brought the water where they were supposed to, they complained, and God provided water for them. Now, God used two different pharaohs to display his power. Now, I'm not talking about the Pharaoh of Joseph's time, but the Pharaoh of Moses. He lived under two pharaohs. He lived under the Pharaoh of when he was a baby. Then he lived under another Pharaoh who was when he was an adult. And so there was one who tried to kill all the firstborn in Egypt, all the firstborn Israelites in Egypt, which God prevented him from doing that. That's when Moses was born. That was one Pharaoh. The other one that he decided to do was he was going to do the one that tried to keep Israel in bondage. And God used him to display his power also. So even though the first Pharaoh tried to kill off the Israelites, God preserved the Israelites through Moses. So it's a pretty interesting thing. So God now has brought these people to the land of the people of Israel, to the Mount Sinai, and he offers them a contract. Okay? That's where the word testament comes from. The testament is a contract. So this is when we refer to the Old Testament is not everything from Genesis 1 on. It's everything from this point on. Now, you have to remember that Moses is writing the Old Testament. So from Genesis 1 on was him writing that. But the testament, the agreement that God had with him is right here. And so now he says this in Exodus chapter 19, verses 5 and 6. Now therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be a special treasure to me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which you shall speak to the children of Israel. So God is telling Moses, he says, listen, you all are going to be a special treasure to me of all the people on the earth, because all the earth is mine. I own it all. The Gentiles, now we're going to have Jewish people. All of these are going to be a special people to me. And so the Gentiles are mine. I own them also. And you shall be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation, a separated nation, one that is marked to be different than the rest of the world, so that the world can look at you and see me working. And that's what they were to be. So the contract with the Lord kind of went something like this. If you do all that I command you, I will bless you beyond your wildest imaginations. Okay? Listen to the first part of that. This is not scripture I'm quoting. I'm just an idea. God is saying in the first part of this contract, I will bless you beyond your wildest imagination. Okay? The second part was, but if you do not obey me, then trouble will come on you in ways that you never thought of. So it's a serious responsibility that God is giving them. If you do what I tell you, I will bless you beyond what you can possibly imagine. But if you don't, if you decide to turn against me and not obey me, then I will trouble you in ways that you've never even thought of. So it's God is not a middle of the ground type of person. He's black and white. Yes, this is good. No, this is bad. And he means what he says. Both of those aspects of the contract were conditional. Blessing for obedience, cursing for disobedience. That's what it was going to be. And who was it that wrote the contract? It was God who wrote the contract. He would hold them and himself. Okay, listen to this. He would hold himself and the people of Israel to the contract because God is a faithful God who cannot violate his character. So God would uphold his end of the bargain absolutely because he's an absolute God. And he would hold the Israelites absolutely. But would they be able to keep it? Are they absolutely good people? Well, I think we know the answer to that, but we'll see what happens. So what did Israel think about this contract? What was it when God offered it to them? How did they respond to this contract? And here's the contract in Exodus 19, verses 7 and 8. So Moses came and called for the elders of the people and laid before them all these words which the Lord commanded him. Then all the people answered together and said, all that the Lord has spoken, we will do. All right? So Moses brought back the words of the people to the Lord. So what God did is God told Moses, this is what I'm going to do. Moses goes down, tells the people says, listen, whatever he says, we're going to do it. And so Moses brings that back there, back up to God. So God gives them a contract. It's like you say you buy a car and there's this contract. And Israel signed on the dotted line when they said, all that he says, we will do. And what they were telling him is, okay, we're going to keep the contract on your terms, God. So Israel agreed to God's terms. And what were those terms? That they would never, ever turn against the Lord. That was their contract. That's what they agreed to. And they would always follow him, no matter what. That's what they agreed to do. So Israel's preconceived ideas of their contract were, here's what they thought about this contract. That they thought that the blessings that God would give would be greater than they could imagine. All right? The second thing is the curses would be less than they could possibly imagine. So in other words, they thought God will bless us for doing what we do beyond what we could wildly imagine. But they also thought, God probably really won't hold that strong to the curse thing, He's going to be okay with the good things, but he's not going to be okay with the bad things. He'll be all right. He'll do what he wants for us because we're pretty good people. But as far as the bad things, he probably is not the kind of God who would do something like that. So that was their preconceived ideas. The cursing would be less than they had imagined. So Israel had a high opinion of their ability to follow God. They really did. Israel had a low opinion of God's ability to keep his agreement. Let's put it that way. So they had a really low opinion of God's ability to bring judgment on them. That's how they thought about this. So Israel had already forgotten about how many times they had disobeyed God. So it was foolish what they were doing. If they would have only said, Lord, we're not able to do this. You've seen us. We've messed up. We won't keep your commandment. Who knows what God would have done? But it was an offer, and it was a legitimate offer to Israel. And so they said, okay, all that he says, we will do. And that was the end of that. So now the contract, you have to understand, demanded perfect obedience. There couldn't be any flaws. There couldn't be any disobedience. It had to be obeyed completely, or there was problems. There was punishment for what they do. Do you think the Lord knew what would happen? Do you think he understood Israel's thought process in all of this? Yeah, he did. But Israel didn't. Israel did not comprehend what was going to happen. They thought everything was going to be hunky-dory and they'd be doing all right. And God would kind of look past some of the little sins and whatever. But he didn't, did he? So God had to bring them to a point where they would quit trusting in themselves and only trust in him. There's an author, Miles Stanford, had a quote years ago that said this: failure is brought about by the Holy Spirit to teach us to have no confidence in the flesh. And I think that's what God is trying to do here. He wants them to get to the point where they have no confidence in their ability to keep the contract. That's what he really wants out of this. So, can you imagine? Let's see. I'm trying to think of an illustration I've used once before. it's like a person. You see these floods that come up, and all of a sudden these waves start coming, and you start seeing them, and the water starts rising, and the car gets stuck in a flood. Like down in Louisiana or Mississippi or Alabama or wherever on the Gulf Coast or Florida or East Coast, and all that water's coming in, and all of a sudden you see somebody on a car and that water's rising, and they get out of the car and they're sitting there on top of the car because they just have no other option, and they know they're going to die, and all of a sudden they see this helicopter coming. And see, they're getting to the point where they recognize that the only hope they have is in somebody else saving them. And see, that's what God is wanting to bring these people to, that the only hope that they had was in this Redeemer that God promised would one day come, this deliverer, and not trust in themselves. But here at this point, they're trusting in their own ability to keep things going, doing well. So Israel, God was obligated to keep his contract, but so is Israel. And God would keep the contract because he's God. Israel would not keep the contract because they were Israel. And so that's what they had. So Israel now is prepared to receive the law at Mount Sinai. And in Exodus 19, verses 9 through 11, it says this: "And the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I come to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you and believe you forever." So Moses told the words of the people to the Lord. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Go to the people and consecrate them today and tomorrow, and let them wash their clothes. And let them be ready for the third day, for on the third day the Lord will come down upon Mount Sinai in the sight of all the people." So Moses goes down, he tells the people, this is what you need to do. You need to wash your clothes, get ready. In 3 days the Lord is coming back. He's going to come down onto this mountain, he's going to speak to us, okay? And then it says this in verses 12, tells them in 3 days the Lord would give the law to the people, the agreement to the contract. And they need to be serious, and they need to be ready for what he's going to do. And then verses 12 and 13 of chapter 19, it says this: "You shall set bounds for the people all around, saying, Take heed to yourselves that you do not go up to the mountain or touch its base. Whoever touches the mountain shall surely be put to death. Not a hand shall touch him, but he shall surely be stoned or shot with an arrow. Whether man or beast, he shall not live. When the trumpet sounds long, they shall come near to the mountain." So God was telling the Israelites that this was a serious event that they were coming up to. This was going to be a really serious time where they had to have their attitudes right. They had to have their everything done well. They were to come with reverence when they came to this mountain. The penalty for disobeying him was death. They said they would be stoned to death or they'd be shot through with arrows. And there'd be separation from God, not only in physical, but spiritual death also. And of course, many of them were anyway, but they'd be separated from God, from the camp of the Israelites if they did what they did. Adam and Eve, remember, they were put out of the garden. They were separated from God. Cain was banished from God's presence. The people of Noah's time were destroyed. The people of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed because they didn't listen to God. And these are events that were meant to remind us that God does mean business about what he says. Now, one thing you have to understand, God was not trying to get Israel. I'm going to get you guys. It wasn't a deal like that at all. He wanted them to recognize that they were sinners, that they were flawed, that they made mistakes, and the penalty was death. But God would provide a way for them through this deliverer, this promised one who was going to be coming. But if they would decided that they wanted to follow the law, they would have to follow it perfectly. No mistakes, no errors, completely without any problems at all. They were to obey it perfectly. And as we continue on in these lessons, we're going to learn and see how well Israel really did. So that's kind of this lesson. So now they're up to the Mount Sinai. Remember that. They're getting ready to receive the law, and we'll continue on, and we'll find out more about God working with the Israelites at this point. Remember, if you want to hear these podcasts, if you're hearing it now or listening to it on anything, you can go to your favorite podcast app. If you're on an Android, if you're using Google Play, you might have to look up the Premature Bible Institute, or I don't know if you can find it under my name, Doug Schaible, or not. But on all your favorite podcasts, you can usually look up my name, Doug Schaible, Schaible, or the Premature Bible Institute, either one. And if you want to listen to the video podcast, just go to YouTube and type in my name, Doug Schaible, and you'll find it there. So just want to thank you for coming this week. Look forward to the next one. Take care. Bye.